Good to be here.
All right, we begin with breaking news. South Korea says there are signs that North Korea is preparing to launch another intercontinental ballistic missile just one day after Pyongyang detonated its sixth and most powerful nuclear test. South Korea responding by firing missiles into the sea, simulating an attack on North Korea's main nuclear site. So, in just hours, the UN Security Council will hold an emergency meeting to consider even stronger sanctions against the North.
President Trump lashing out at an ally instead of an adversary, accusing South Korea of, quote, appeasement, while the president's defense secretary is warning North Korea of a massive military response. All of this as CNN learns President Trump is expected to end a program that protects undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children from being deported. Now, the move once again pitting the president against many in his own party. We have the global resources of CNN covering it all for you. Let's begin with CNN's Will Ripley. He was just in North Korea, where he's been more than a dozen times. Live for us in Tokyo with the breaking news out of the region. Good morning, Will.
Hi, Dave. We are hearing now that a week that already began with a bang could get even more tense here in this part of the world. There are reports out of South Korea that they are observing what they say are continuous signs that the regime led by Kim Jong-un is preparing for yet another ballistic missile launch. South Korea is saying this could be a new kind of submarine launch ballistic missile. It could be an intermediate range ballistic missile, the kind that they launched over Hokkaido, the northern island here in Japan last week, or it could be even more provocative than that. It could be an intercontinental ballistic missile, the kind that they launched twice in July. And South Korea believes that the trajectory for this missile could be the Pacific Ocean, a region that could possibly include the U.S. territory of Guam. South Korea thinks this missile could be fired at a normal trajectory, which means it would travel a further distance, as opposed to other tests where the missiles have gone up to a very high altitude but haven't traveled that far of a distance, often coming down in the waters off of Japan. Now, this would not be entirely a surprise. North Korea has been saying now for weeks that they are preparing to launch more missiles toward the Pacific. After their launch last week, they said that that launch was a prelude for military action aimed at containing Guam, home to Andersen Air Force Base, Naval Base Guam, and more than 160,000 American citizens. If North Korea follows through with that, it would be after conducting their most powerful nuclear test to date and after releasing images of their supreme leader standing in front of a miniaturized nuclear warhead that North Korea says could go on a ballistic missile, the kind that South Korea now says North Korea may be preparing to launch, possibly by Saturday, which is a major holiday for North Korea, the day that that country was founded. North Korea often likes to show force on major holidays, but for them to do this, perhaps less than a week after their largest nuclear test to date, would take the tensions to a whole new level, Allison.
Okay, Will, thank you very much for all of that context. South Korea, meanwhile, showing its military might, responding to North Korea's threat by simulating an attack on the North's main nuclear test site. CNN's Paula Hancock is live in Seoul for us with all of the breaking details. What have you learned, Paula?
Well, Alison, we know there's been a series of live fire drills by South Korea. They've had fighter jets involved. They've had surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. It has all been very visual, which, of course, is no accident. They're sending a very strong message to North Korea. And as you say, the simulation was they were attacking North Korea's assets off the east coast of the Korean Peninsula. Also hearing from the Defense Ministry that this was also showing a willingness to be able to target the enemy's leadership. We have heard this before from North Korea. It is a very thinly veiled threat to Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, saying that this is the capability we have to take out the leadership if need be. We're also hearing from the South Korean side that they want the US to send more strategic assets, military strategic assets to the region, like aircraft carriers, like bombers. We could be seeing that within the next few days if South Korea gets its way. It certainly wants more shows of force with the US, basically to show the US-South Korean alliance is strong. When you think about what is happening in the political arena, the US President Donald Trump tweeting that South Korea is talking about appeasement with North Korea. That did not go down well here. And also the fact he's spoken twice with Japan's leader, but not once with President Moon here in South Korea recently. That's not going down well at all. Dave.
Well, thanks. President Trump and his national security team closely watching this situation. Defense Secretary James Mattis delivering a stern warning to North Korea from the White House. CNN's Barbara Starr live at the Pentagon with the latest. Barbara, good morning to you. The Defense Secretary, very stern, very rarely speaks out directly to the cameras. What do you make of his reaction?
Well, good morning, Dave. The question now still unanswered. What will the Trump administration do next? No word yet if they will, in fact, send an aircraft carrier or bomber aircraft, as the South Koreans are suggesting. And in fact, President Trump continuing to try and pull the lever of trade to pressure other countries to move against North Korea. The president tweeting, and I quote, "The United States is considering, in addition to other options, stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea." That would have fairly significant global implications, obviously, as you say. Defense Secretary Mattis coming out at the White House reaffirming the ironclad commitment to South Korea if they are nervous about it, also very much on the military page. Have a listen.
Any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam, or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming. We are not looking to the total annihilation of a country, namely North Korea. But as I said, we have many options to do so.
Annihilation not of North Korea per se, but perhaps of Kim Jong-un and his regime. The U.S. position is very much, if Kim were to attack, the U.S. would retaliate. Allison, Dave.
All right, Barbara, thank you very much for all of your reporting. Obviously, we'll check back with you throughout the program. Let's bring back now Will Ripley. Joining us also is Gordon Chang. He's the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and a columnist of the Daily Beast. We also have retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He's a CNN military analyst and was the Army Commanding General for Europe and the 7th Army. Great to have all of you experts with us this morning. Gordon Chang, let's just talk about real options today. Forget the rhetoric. What are the real options to deal with North Korea?
Yeah, there's way too much war talk. I think the options are, how do we use our economy and our financial system to deny Kim the resources to build missiles and nukes?
What's the answer to that? How do we use the economy?
I think we talk about an embargo, and largely because, we have had these serial sanctions on North Korea, including the last set, which were adopted on August 5, but they only restrict a small portion, in this case a third, of North Korea's legal exports, and it doesn't even take into account the stuff that North Korea is sending to Iran, which is about $2 to $3 billion a year the Iranians pay. So what we really need to do is go after the oil and all the other things that keeps Kim in business. If the United States is going to show some political will, then I think essentially the Chinese and the North Koreans are going to step back and they'd be much more amenable to talking.
Even though China, sorry, Dave, even though China just said that it's unacceptable that the U.S. would ever issue sanctions against it.
Yeah, sure. And they always say that. But nonetheless, we cannot allow the Chinese to, for instance, use our financial system to launder money for the North Koreans. We can't allow the Chinese to sell semi-processed fissile material to the North Koreans or supply, the most recent ballistic missile technology, which they apparently did. So, it is going to be difficult, but we have no good options. But the better options are using our economy rather than our military to settle this, because we don't want history's last war.
Right, but Will, what can we do to that notion that the Chinese have said is unacceptable? What can we do to pressure China into cutting off all trade with North Korea, in particular fuel?
Well, the United States could impose or continue to impose its own sanctions on Chinese companies, Chinese banks, for example, cutting them off from access to global financial markets, which would infuriate Beijing. The United States is also continuing to put on the table this potential military option, which makes Beijing very uncomfortable. In fact, there have been editorials in the Global Times, a state media outlet that often provides more hawkish views, saying that if the United States were to launch a preemptive strike, that China should actually step in. So the rhetoric heating up there. But if Beijing actually were to think that the U.S. were serious about a military option, would they then be more willing to go beyond what they've done over the last many years that has proven to be very ineffective? I mean, I was in North Korea just last week, and every time we go in, we see Chinese cars, Chinese products on store shelves. There is Chinese oil flowing into the country, all the reports of a spike in gas prices as of late. So China does have a lot of leverage, but the U.S. also has leverage over China, given the hundreds of billions of dollars in trade between the two countries each year. And you saw that tweet from President Trump, by the way, saying that the U.S. might consider cutting off trade with all countries that trade with North Korea. Obviously, that was a thinly veiled threat at China there.
But Will, you've spoken to North Korean officials about this numerous times. Is there anything that will stop their nuclear program?
They say absolutely not. And they say, and I've actually asked this specific question, even if North Korea were to be cut off completely by China, if China were to stop trading, stop dealing with North Korea economically, North Korea says they would survive. And they point as an example to the Great Famine of the late 1990s, when there were hundreds of thousands of people at least dying of starvation in the country. Yet the regime, despite predictions that it would collapse, it remained firmly in control. They still were developing and launching missiles during that time. And of course, they conducted their first nuclear test just after coming out of that famine back in 2006. And so clearly, North Korea feels that they're more self-sufficient today than they were back then. The famine was the result of economic mismanagement in the country, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, as well as a series of natural disasters. And so the North Koreans say they've been through bad times before, and they're willing to do it again. And they say the last thing that they'll cut is their nuclear program and their missile program.
So, General Hertling, that leads us to the military option, the one that Mattis was alluding to when he said, you know, we're not talking about total annihilation of a country, but obviously we're capable of it. And then what Barbara Starr ended on, where she said, the idea isn't necessarily to annihilate North Korea, but maybe the regime, maybe the Kim Jong-un regime. So is that possible?
It's probably not, Allison, and what I'd suggest is Secretary Mattis was very precise and very succinct in the words he used yesterday, and that was for a purpose. It was to buy time for the other elements of national power. He was basically saying, you threaten us or our territories or our allies, and we're coming after you. He didn't talk anything about new tests, new launches into the middle of the ocean. He talked about specific threats to U.S. National territories or allies. So with that on the table, I think that really puts, I believe that puts Kim Jong-un back on his heels a little bit. He may continue to do the missile test. He may even do another nuclear test. But he realizes that he's got to be very careful on where he launches those things. That allows the other elements of national power to start working. Now, here's the thing. Nothing has changed in terms of the motivations of North Korea or China in this particular regard. North Korea is still very much interested in having a military strength. They want recognition on the world stage, and they want to try and improve their economy. China will not do anything unless they see they have some advantages here. So we have to really look at the motivations of our allies in this country as well as our foes in order to get something done. And just the bluster and the brashness won't do that. We have to bring allies into the tent as we've done before and address the motivations of these countries and to see what they will do to change their approach. China to increase embargoes, North Korea to stop these kind of launches, and it perhaps needs to take a new track.
Gordon, to that point about our allies, in particular in South Korea, we have 10 million South Koreans 35 miles from the North Korean border there in Seoul. And the president is tweeting about appeasement, about South Korea appeasing the North, cutting off trade with South Korea. How does that impact this entire situation?
Well, the South Korean leadership a few hours ago wasn't very happy. Clearly this is we don't like South Korea week, because also just a few days ago, before the nuclear test, there were all these reports circulating in Washington that the president wanted to send a notice of termination of the U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement. That's not a good idea, even though the South Koreans have been cheating on that agreement, because this is a strategic issue. And, it was never a good idea to try to walk away from that deal. But this is absolutely the worst week to do that, because we need, as General Hertling said, our allies on board.
Panel, thank you all very much. Obviously, we'll be covering this top story and whatever breaking developments we have throughout the morning. Now to our other top story. Sources tell CNN that President Trump is expected to end the program protecting young, undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers from being deported. CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with more details for us. Hi, Joe.
Good morning, Allison. The announcement is expected tomorrow. Ending DACA in this way with a 6-month pause would fulfill one of the president's long-standing campaign promises, while also putting the burden for reinstating the program on congressional Republicans, including the Speaker of the House, who said the program should not be scrapped.
Should Dreamers be worried?
We love the Dreamers. We love everybody.
Sources tell CNN that President Trump is expected to end an Obama-era program that protects young undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children from being deported. The issue, one of the president's core campaign promises.
I want the children that are growing up in the United States to be dreamers also. They're not dreaming right now.
President Trump's plan would affect some 800,000 so-called dreamers studying and working in the U.S. Two sources with knowledge of Trump's thinking tell CNN that the president is planning to delay his action for 6 months, giving Congress time to come up with a legislative replacement to DACA. But a growing number of Republicans are speaking out against the move.
These kids don't know any other home. I think there's a humane way to fix this. I think President Trump agrees with fixing this, and it's got to be up to the legislature.
There are 800,000 DACA kids who were brought across the border. The median age, I think, is 6 years old for those 800,000 when they came across the border. They should not be punished for the sins of their parents.
Senator Bernie Sanders says ending the program would be one of the ugliest and cruelest decisions ever made, while Republican Congressman Steve King praised it as a chance to restore rule of law.
We are going to deal with DACA with heart. I have to deal with a lot of politicians, don't forget.
Some 800,000 in this country, and how will Republicans in Congress respond? Discuss with our panel next. Sources tell CNN President Trump will end the program protecting young undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children from being deported. So can dreamers count on Congress to pass a bill to keep them in the U.S. before that deadline? Let's discuss with our panel this morning. CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza, CNN political analyst Karen DeMargin, and CNN political commentator Errol Louis. Chris, let me start with you. Sure. Who is happy with this decision? Because the hashtag Defend DACA is exploding on Twitter with people furious at the president's decision. Then you look at his immigration base. Basically, that's two people leading it. Ann Coulter, who says, technically, I wanted Donald Trump to end it 7 months ago. Now that we're a day away from courts taking it, I wish he'd paused it. Steve King, Iowa congressman, as well, not happy. Ending DACA now gives chance to restore rule of law, but delaying it could push amnesty, Republican suicide. Who likes this decision?
Honestly, Donald Trump. And here's the reason. Because it takes the ball, which was very firmly in his court on this, because of the Attorney General deadline for September 5th. And puts it in Congress's court. I know this is being read, and understandably so, given the threat to end the Dreamers program in 6 months as Donald Trump ending it. But I would say what Donald Trump is essentially doing is handing it to Congress because he doesn't really want to end it. Of all the things in this campaign and in his presidency, early days of his presidency, Donald Trump has been the most thoughtful, insightful, I guess might be the word, about the Dreamers. He's made very clear he's very divided on it. I think what he's saying in this decision is, I'm going to give it to Congress, and I actually think he hopes Congress finds some way through it. He can't seem to find a way. I'm skeptical that Congress is able to pass anything big because this is going to have to be a Republican and Democratic votes. This is not just going to be a Republican bill because there are enough people like Steve King, particularly in the House, who I think would make it hard for Paul Ryan to just pass this, some form of protection for Dreamers with just Republican votes. But I actually think that's what Trump's up to. I don't think this is a secret plot, because if he wanted to, he could have ended it tomorrow.
Right, sure. And so, Errol, I mean, isn't it that his hand is being forced by these 10 state attorneys general? And so, look, the president, I think, has been publicly conflicted about the Dreamers, and also publicly said that he wants to do it with compassion. He wants to keep families together. So is it really that there was this looming legal battle, so he had to act this weekend?
His hand is being forced. He would have, I think, greatly preferred to not have to deal with this. This is where rhetoric meets reality. This is not a new issue by any means. The DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001, and so here we are almost 17 years later, and I don't think we're any closer to consensus. I don't think Congress wants this, despite what Speaker Ryan said. I think he's going to have a ticking time bomb, handed to him, a grenade that he's going to have to start juggling if it comes to him. Because the reality is, both within the Republican conference and certainly if they try and strike some bargain with Democrats, there is no consensus about how to proceed on this stuff. There's a sort of a Republican version of this that's been floating around, but then when they try to sort of bring on some of the hardliners like Steve King, it starts getting wrapped up with funding for the wall, and you're going to go right back to partisan gridlock. Again, there's a reason that they haven't found consensus on this. The president's not going to necessarily figure it out on his own. The attorneys general are not going to figure it out in court. And there's no reason to think that Congress is going to figure it out.
The difficulty in this, Karen, is probably best encapsulated by the president's own words, evolving rhetoric on this. Let's hear what the president has said, evolving over time about DACA.
We will immediately terminate President Obama's 2 illegal executive amnesties in which he defied federal law and the Constitution to give amnesty to approximately 5 million illegal immigrants.
When somebody's terrific, we want them back here.
Should they have to
but
leave
they have
too?
to be legally. Look, it sounds cold and it sounds hard. We have a country. Our country's going to hell. We have to have a system where people are legally in our country. We're always talking about dreamers for other people. I want the children that are growing up in the United States to be dreamers also. They're not dreaming right now.
Karen, did the president punt this because he doesn't know where he is on the Dreamers Act?
Well, your montage there stopped, well over a year ago, and as we've heard, the president has made statements since becoming president that are a lot more sober about this and a lot more sympathetic to the plight of the Dreamers. He seems to be somebody who's stuck between changing instincts and his base, which is not the only time Trump has been in that position. And he seems to be trying to find a way to thread that needle, which is why you say, okay, I'm going to end the program, but I'm not going to end it immediately because I'm going to give Congress an actual measure of time to have a chance to change this. The issue, though, is, as the other 2 guests just pointed out, it's not an easy fix in Congress. But Chris made the point that it would be difficult for Congress to do something big. The key in this instance is actually to try to keep it small, because what you can probably do is get consensus around the effectively some version of the DREAM Act. You have the Democrats probably willing to vote to a person for that bill, and you have a contingent of Republicans who are willing to do the same thing as well, who have said that, who have drafted new bills, who have partnered with Democrats, who in some cases in the Senate have even voted for comprehensive immigration reform before, and this would be a no-brainer for them. But the problem is you need to let leaders actually have it, put it on the floor for that vote. And so and they're not there yet. So to have this work, the math of this means that you actually have to have the congressional Republican leaders also be willing to kind of pass the ball over to their members and not be a blocking mechanism for those Republicans for whom it is anathema to open any floodgates to any immigrants until you step up border security. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the wall that Trump's after, but it means something in terms of border security. And this has always been where these things get stuck, because Republicans traditionally want border security before anything. There's an exception that some of them have made mentally for these kids because they are such a sympathetic case, but it's not the party. So this cannot be a Republican-only thing. It has to be a real aisle crosser that relies in large part on Democratic votes with some Republicans, and that's ground the president hasn't quite tread yet. So it'll be a unique thing if this can get through.
Well, left in the lurch here, those 800,000 young people brought to this country through no choice of their own, no clue what their future looks like in this country.
Absolutely. Panel, thank you very much for all of your insights into that. Meanwhile, there are some frantic efforts underway to get safe drinking water to the city that is very hard hit by Harvey. And now there's a new monster storm in the Atlantic. Will it hit the U.S.? We'll tell you about those next. Drinking water days after Harvey. More than 100,000 people are forced to line up for bottled water there. CNN's Kaylee Hartung is live in Beaumont with all of the latest. Any progress, Kaylee?
Well, Allison, the water of the Neches River is still too high for the city to even assess the damage to their 2 intake facilities. Those facilities flooded with more than 10 feet of water. But the good news is a temporary fix has water returning to faucets here. It was a collaboration between a private company and the city, and it's a very welcome sight to see that water flowing, but you can't drink it. That boil notice is still in effect for the water that you do now see coming out of the tap. So with that in mind, people do need that safe drinking water. So the city has set up a couple of points of distribution that have been running incredibly efficiently. You queue up with your car, roll down the window or pop the trunk, and they'll toss in a couple of cases or a couple of gallons. They're also thinking about those who can't line up in that manner. Meals on Wheels and city buses are teaming up to deliver water to some elderly folks who can't leave their homes. So while this site is still submerged, as many other places are in Beaumont, Houston is now saying that 95% of that city is dry and it is more up and operational. But these effects still being felt in so many places in Southeast Texas, but also across the country. At gas pumps across the country, we're seeing a spike of about 94 cents per gallon. The effects of Harvey can be felt by all. Dave?
No doubt, people across the country feeling that. All right, Kelly Hartung live for us in Beaumont. Thanks so much. If that's not enough, Hurricane Irma gaining strength, tracking towards the United States. Will this monster make landfall along the East Coast? CNN meteorologist Allison Chinchar has the latest at the CNN Weather Center in Atlanta. Good morning, Allison.
And good morning to you. Let's get right to it. The weather report presented by Xyzal, the allergy medicine for continuous 24 allergy relief. Hurricane Irma is a powerful Category 3 storm. Winds right now about 115 miles per hour. The movement is west-southwest at about 14 miles per hour. That means in the coming days, places like the Leeward Islands, Puerto Rico, we're talking Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas are going to be prime targets for this particular storm. The concern in the short term is that we do expect it to intensify even more up to a Category 4 storm, likely in about 24 hours from now. Then the question becomes, where does it go from there? So you have to take a look at what's going to be steering this storm in the long term. Right now, it's this high pressure that you see right here. That's what's steering the storm as we speak. But once it gets closer to Florida, you're going to have to start taking into consideration the jet that's building in the U.S. That is likely what's going to keep it safe from Florida or up the East Coast. Now, exactly where that landfall may be, Allison, is still up in the air because you'd be talking, if it makes landfall in the U.S., it wouldn't be till at least a week from today, but certainly something to keep a close eye on.
Okay, Allison, thank you very much for that. I know you will be keeping a close eye on it for us. What does North Korea's latest test tell us about their future plans? General Michael Hayden, the former head of the CIA, joins us live next.
August 2017.
South Korea says they're seeing signs that North Korea is preparing for yet another missile test. They've already done 6 such tests. President Trump and his cabinet are now going over their options. So joining us now is CNN national security analyst and former head of the CIA and the NSA, Michael Hayden. General Hayden, thanks so much for being here.
Morning.
You said yesterday, Mr. President, you were addressing President Trump, this is not a manhood issue. This is a national security issue. Don't let your pride get ahead of wise policy here. Is that what you see happening?
Well, so far, and I was very impressed with a very tough but a very careful statement by Secretary Mattis as he left a meeting with the president yesterday afternoon. Secretary Mattis had very strong language, but it was about a North Korean threat, not a North Korean capability. And in other words, Allison, I think he was trying to make a distinction between we're willing to preempt an imminent threat from North Korea, but we're not willing, it's not our policy, at least not yet, to conduct a preventive war to prevent the North Koreans from acquiring that kind of capability. It's a fine distinction, but I think it's a big deal and a very useful statement on his part.
But what about that language, General? I mean, what about Mattis saying, you know, we're talking about the total annihilation of a country, not that that's what we're saying, but we're capable of that. I mean, does upping this, you know, rhetorical hyperbole, is that helping? Since then, Kim Jong-un just fires back, you know, an even more sort of overheated hyperbolic statement.
No, he does. But again, a very tough but a very precise statement, which is a little bit different than some of the things the president has been allowing himself to say, Allison, which has been very tough but very imprecise, and that could lead to great danger. Look, what I think Secretary Mattis was doing was simply trying to convince the North that we have this option, and they cannot be certain we would never use it under certain circumstances. So I think he was trying to cabin North Korean thinking from that direction with the goal of hurting them in this direction, which is diplomatic and negotiations.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What are the real world options here for the U.S., for Japan, for South Korea? Really, what can we do today?
Well, you know, despite the president criticizing the South Korean government for appeasement, and I heard Gordon and others talk about that earlier in the show, The off-ramp here, Allison, is we're going to talk to the North Koreans. It's just the conditions under which the talks will begin. And frankly, I think it's a sad reality that the talks will be about limiting, controlling, perhaps making more transparent a North Korean nuclear program, not dismantling that program.
And when you say we're going to talk to the North Koreans, what are those talks going to look like? Who's going to go over and talk to them?
No, that's really interesting because we've tried 2-party formats, 4-party formats, 6-party formats. I actually think, and here's a strange coincidence, Allison, I think both the North Koreans and we, the Americans, are trying to pressure the Chinese to create the format we would prefer for the talks. The North Koreans want the Chinese to lean on us to, frankly, accept an awful lot of the North Korean program going in. We would want to lean on the Chinese to create a format in which the North Koreans at least promise to stop testing before we agree to talk. So we're both playing the same game against the same player.
Okay, so if it all comes down to the Chinese negotiating this, is now the time for the Security Council at the UN or anybody to inflict more sort of economic sanctions in terms of trade with China?
First of all, the UN won't sanction China. They'll sanction Korea. And frankly, there's a meeting today, and I think it's a wise thing for us to try to amp up the pressure there as much as possible. Now, as far as the Chinese actually doing some of the things we want, Allison, a couple of factors come to mind. Number one, Xi Jinping is going to be obsessed with internal matters till about October. So I do think this is a bit of a longer fuse than we may have anticipated going in. The second, the high leverage we have, these would be national sanctions, secondary sanctions against Chinese firms who continue to do business with North Korea. And if that begins to touch the Chinese banking industry, we'll be poking on an exposed nerve there.
Oh boy. General Hayden, always great to get your insight and expertise into all of this. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Allison.
Dave.
All right, Congress has an awful lot to tackle when they return to Washington tomorrow, from Harvey relief to a new spending bill, tax reform, health care. What can they get done, if anything, this year? We discuss next. All right, Congress back in session tomorrow, facing a daunting agenda, some tight deadlines. You have a Harvey relief bill, the debt ceiling, a new federal spending bill, tax reform, health care.
You can go on.
Not much. What can they get done? Let's discuss with our panel. Chris Cillizza, Karen DeMargin, and Errol Lewis. Errol, let's start with you. Harvey funding, probably the most obvious and seemingly easy thing to get done. And still, Steve Mnuchin kind of gummed up the works by saying you have to tie that funding to raising the debt ceiling. Will that even be simple, given what's going on in Congress today?
Well, it seems like a reasonable way to try and get through what's going to be a very difficult legislative session by trying to maybe bootstrap one of the more important ones, like the debt ceiling, onto the aid that nobody's going to disagree with. So it's a pretty standard ploy, actually. It might be an easy way to get Congress to sort of step back from the brink on one of these important issues. I mean, this is one that's going to, the debt ceiling could be a black eye, not just for Congress, but certainly for the White House, and an enormous headache for the Treasury Secretary in particular, but the White House in general.
Just to be clear, Mark Meadows said that's a terrible idea, the House Freedom Caucus chair, to tie the two. Allison.
Karen, you stalk the halls of Congress every day. What do you think they're going to tackle first?
Well, I think that the very first thing that they have said that they're going to tackle actually is the NDAA, which is an annual defense spending bill, and they're going to give that some time to try to clear that off the books before they move on to all of these other issues that are the really pressing ones that they have to finish by the end of the month, about the continuing resolution, about Harvey funding, and then, of course, there's the coming looming debt ceiling approaching. That'll give them a little bit of time to try to work out exactly how this is going to look legislatively. But we're going to have all of that going on, and those fights will have to come to some sort of conclusion to get bills out the door to keep the government from shutting down, but they won't be over, because we're talking about there being then a few months later other deadlines coming up that will require us to look at what the next tranche of funding will be like for the Hurricane Harvey relief, and more serious policy fights will be down the line. And of course, in my specific beat, I'll be looking again also at the Russia investigations reheating up because you have some of Trump's inner circle making their way down to Capitol Hill in the next month, and that will be a new chapter in that ongoing
saga, investigation, drama.
Yeah,
fill in the blank.
It's
know.
difficult.
Yeah.
Are you looking at it as specifically a probe or as all the political stuff that happens around it? Right, it's both.
Well, it looks like a full-on obstruction of justice investigation, but let's move on to the greater context of all this, Chris. How does it impact what they have to get done in 12 legislative days? That the president leading up to this is taking on John McCain and Jeff Flake and numerous other Republican senators. Then John McCain's firing back in the Washington Post saying he's poorly informed, impulsive with his actions and his words. How does all that change what they're trying to get done?
Well, as an expert, I can conclude that's not good. Look, the fact here is that I did a quick count last week. Donald Trump had insulted or publicly attacked 11 Republican senators, including the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, since coming into office or during the campaign. 11. There's only 52 of them, so it's about 20% of them. He continues to struggle with the idea, and I don't know whether he doesn't get it or he doesn't choose to get it, that these members of Congress, even though they're Republicans, don't work for him. This isn't the Republican Party or the nation is not just one big corporation where if you're at the top, which he is president, you're at the top of one of the branches, that doesn't mean that the legislative branch works for you. And that's the thing I think he continues to struggle with. Well, why don't they just do what I say? It's going to be very tough, I think, to just on the specific debt ceiling, Hurricane Harvey stuff. That's two pills that conservatives do not necessarily want to swallow. Huge amounts of federal funding for Harvey. Now, understandably, you see the images. I think you'll see many of, coming out of Houston, I should say, you'll see many of them say this is a unique situation. It's a once in a fill-in-the-blank year's flood. Let's do it. But in the past, disaster relief has been a real bugbear for conservatives who have been very resistant to just dumping federal money. And then the debt ceiling is a thing they hate just as much as that. Why are we raising it? Why do we continue to spend? We have this unlimited credit card. Why are we doing that? So the problem you have is these are hard issues even for a president with significant political capital who has demonstrated significant knowledge of how to work with Congress. This president does not have significant political capital and has demonstrated the opposite in terms of how to work with Congress. And that's why I'm skeptical he's going to be able to persuade.
But this doesn't depend entirely on the president. Sorry. There is at least, in a way, Hurricane Harvey, as tragic and awful as it is an incentive for the government not to shut down. And also, you are hearing signs from Republican leaders in Congress, at least, that are saying, look, the debt ceiling is about making good on the bills that we've already run up. It's not about, it's not necessarily even about new spending. It's about covering our debts. And so at least you're hearing those sorts of tones right now coming from the upper echelons of the party. Whether those leaders can keep all their rank and file in line and whether the president, his base starts to get very active about some of these fiscal issues, that's going to change things.
Errol, very quickly, there's no chance the government shuts down, right?
Well, not with people at deadly risk in Texas. Absolutely not. And with hydrogen bombs being fired off and missiles flying over our ally Tokyo, I mean, you simply can't. It's unimaginably bad. And I understand Steve Mnuchin not wanting to have to do all of what he'll have to do to avoid a shutdown, but that might be a bridge too far.
Panel, thank you all very much.
All right, the very latest on the threat from North Korea. The North showing signs of preparing for yet another missile test this week as the South simulates an attack on the North. The global resources of CNN have it all.